Alright guys, have you heard the phrase, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory you gain, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Sun Tzu said that. And I'd say he knows a little more about fighting than you do, pal, because he invented it, and then he perfected it so that no living man could best him in the Ring of Honor. Now, the way I interpret this quote in the Battle Cats is that basically, if you go in the stage blindly, you'll have a good chance of losing. If you thoroughly inspect the stage and the enemies before entering, then you would know which cats to bring to counter the enemies, and know how to exploit the game mechanics to the fullest. Knowing is half the battle. And here I'll help you a little on the knowing part of stages. First, I'll link you back to Spica, or the Battle Cats database again. Like I've said in my previous discussion video, it's a very helpful website that contains almost everything related to Battle Cats, from cats, enemies, combo effects, and stages and specifics. I'll be using this as a reference to show how stages works. Again, if you want to access Spica, turn off Adblock and use Chrome or use the translation plugin since the website is in Japanese. Now, let's go. Something to note is that Battle Cats runs in 30 frames per second, so if you see a time constant in this video that is not seconds, it's probably frames. 30 frames, 1 second, easy. Moving on. Now, things to talk about here is that what's in the stage and what's in an enemy group and how do they work. First off is a quick one. A stage has several different properties that differs themselves on each other. Energy cost, base XP drop, item drop, and their drop chance, base health, stage width, enemy limit, and finally the enemy group. Most of them are self-explanatory, so I'll talk about enemy limit. Just like how you can have a maximum of 50 cats in a stage at once, this same rule applies to the enemies, with a different limit on different stages. Once enough enemies are in a stage, they won't spawn a new enemy until one of them dies. Here's an example. Alaska has an enemy limit of 10. Although there are more than 10 squirrels in the level, only 10 will show up at once. They won't spawn another one until you kill one of them. If you kill multiple of them, then the cycle continues. Another easy example of this is Kugelschreiber, a stage with an enemy limit of 1. That's right, this stage only allows only one enemy at a time. No matter what happens, as long as there is one enemy in the stage, no other will show up. This is pretty simple, but we'll get to enemy limit again soon enough. And now this is the meat of the video, the enemy group. There are 6 things to take note here in one enemy group. Magnification, number of enemies in one group, base health trigger, time trigger, spawn cycle, and although it's not mentioned here, priority. Now, how do I explain this enemy group as a whole? It's a group of enemies. You'll get it by the end of the video, I hope. Let's move on one by one first. I'll take 2 pretty popular stage schematics, Star Ocean and Gestalt Decay. Magnification. Fairly self-explanatory, this shows how strong a group of enemies are, based off their original stats. Let's take this single group of Doge in Star Ocean. This fella have 2000% magnification, which means that when they initially have this base stats, this specific group of Doge are 20 times stronger than the regular ones, having these stats instead. It's as simple as that. Number of enemies means that there is a limit to how much enemies are in the group. The number of enemies can vary from 1, usually the boss, to infinity, which are usually the peons. In the case of Star Ocean, it's everything except the boss. So let's look at Gestalt Decay on this one. The start of Gestalt Decay consists of 1 Scizoroo, 3 Croxos, and 5 Shibalians. Once they spawn enough of them, they will stop spawning anything and this entire group will basically disappear out of the enemy queue. If the number is infinite, then they'll keep on spawning. Speaking of bosses, some enemies will be labeled as boss in stage schematic. These enemies will only consist of 1 and will have these 3 special properties. 1. They will always deliver a harmless blast that pushes all your units backwards. 2. They cannot be knocked back behind the enemy base, and if they are already behind the base, then they will stay there when they are knocked back. And 3. They will usually spawn slightly in front of the enemy base, when the others usually spawn slightly behind. There seems to be some exception for 2 and 3, but they're negligible for most cases. Different bosses also seems to have different hitbox width, like Nyandam staying fairly far away from the base, while other units like Cory have a small width. Some stages have peons labeled as boss instead of the actual powerhouse of the enemy, so the actual boss may be pushed behind the base. Moving on, let's talk about spawn trigger. These are the conditions that determine when a certain groups of enemies are active and will start spawning enemies in their group. There are 2 types of spawn trigger, by timer and by enemy base health. By timer means that they will start spawning enemies in the group and start a cycle when a certain period of time has passed by. By base health means that they will start spawning enemies when the enemy base drops below a certain percentage. Take note that those who spawns by enemy base percentage all have 0 frame timer. I assume it's because the timer starts at the start of the game and they cannot make another timer running when a base is hit under a certain percentage. And if they want to put the timer above 0 frame, then they may not spawn when the base is hit. Anyways, basically they will start their cycle immediately when base is hit. That means that no enemy will spawn, say, 5 seconds after the base fall down under 90% health. Hearing this, you might ask, but Lucas, what about, example, the black enemies in Gestalt Decay? Why do they spawn later after the aliens? Shouldn't they spawn immediately? Well, my friend, that'll also be discussed later. Now, spawn cycle. Simply put, an enemy group with multiple enemies in it will have a spawn interval. They can be a fixed number or a range between a maximum and a minimum number, in which the game will randomly choose between them if this is the case. When one enemy from the group spawn, they will initiate a timer with set number, and after a set period of time, they will spawn another. This goes on until there are no more enemies in the group left. For example, the start of Gestalt Decay have 3 Kaxzers and 5 Shibelians, right? With 150 to 300 frames and 100 to 300 frames interval respectively. Every time you start the game, their first time spawning will always be a set period of time, but once the cycle starts, everything else spawn randomly through a generated interval in between the minimum and the maximum interval range, unless the interval is set. If the interval is set, then the enemy will always spawn at the exact frame. And now this is something that isn't written directly, spawn priority. This is pretty much the entire reason that I bring up Star Ocean and Gestalt Decay. Now when you read a level page in Spica, there exists something called spawn priority. Basically this links back to the enemy limit and everything else. When a stage reaches their enemy limit, they will halt all production of enemies. They will still continue timers and interval until they reach 0, so enemies that are supposed to spawn but halt from enemy limit will basically be put in a queue and their timer will stop there. Now enemy priority is basically what it says on the can. Whichever has the higher priority will be spawned first. The ordering of priority when reading in Spica is highest priority from the bottom and lowest priority on the top. To give you an example, remember when I brought up earlier about the black enemies in Gestalt being spawned after the alien waves? Well, look at the stage schematics. Remember that Gestalt have a 15 enemy limit and that the first thing that they spawn are always 3 Scissoroos and a whole bunch of Shibelians and Kaxzers. Does this make sense to you? Going up, the priority goes smaller and smaller, and I think you can kinda understand from here. Following the gameplay of Gestalt Decay, they will start spawning from the enemies at the bottom to the top, even though they all technically are supposed to spawn right when the base goes under 99%. Now moving on to Star Ocean, you know that Star Ocean Doge gets stronger over time, right? Well, these are all from timers. You trigger a high priority low magnification Dark Doge by hitting the base. Then after some time, more Dark Doge enemy group will show up with increasing magnification over time every 1000 frames since the start of battle, with them being higher priority as they increase in magnification. And finally, on the 8000 frames mark, they will have the highest priority aside from the missed sign and have a 2 frames interval. You know this thing is deadly. This is basically why that after 8000 frames in the stage gets incredibly difficult and nearly impossible to win. On 8000 frames countdown, you get a high priority Doge with an unlimited amount, 2000 magnification, and 2 frame spawn interval. I'm sure you also have heard of missed sign cheesing. Missed sign is an enemy that usually spawns every 10 minutes in the stage and always have the highest priority in the stage. They are harmless and easily stackable. You can abuse the enemy limit for cheesing some stages, most popularly Manic Mohawk. There's even a stage that purely focuses on missed sign cheese. It's really stupid, I know. You're forced to do a modified missed sign cheese or else you're fighting a stupidly buff enemies. In fact, pretty much the entire subchapter for Grotesque Gallery would pretty much teach you about this. Now, how do you exploit this or just use this enemy limit priority queue thing? Well, think of it like this. For certain stages, the faster you kill enemies in numbers, the faster enemies will start spawning their units in the queue. Obviously, this won't apply to all stages, only ones that utilizes priority queue to delay spawns. Example stages would be Underground, No More Bad Dreams, Black Premonition, Oil Platform to name a few. These are all Banban stages. Oh wait, we also have Bionic Seaweed, that's not a Banban stage. Anyways, in stages such as No More Bad Dreams, you may realize that different playthroughs have different spawn times for the Banbans. This is based off on how quickly you kill the peons. The faster you kill the peons, the faster the enemy queue goes up. This is why luring can be a viable option and that Crazed Growth may make Banban spawn faster, since Crazed Growth kills the peons fast. It's somewhat of a similar reason why you should lure in Gestalt. Luring in Gestalt means that you are pressured less by an overwhelming number of enemies that rushes you down fast since you also don't kill them too quickly, which makes their spawning rate less intense. By the way, only one enemy will spawn every 2 frames. Therefore, no 2 enemies will spawn in the same frame. Whichever have the higher priority will spawn first. Well, I think that should wrap it up for the explanation. I'm gonna guess that some of you still don't understand, and that's fine. Just keep spamming Ubers and it really won't matter. Though actually, I want to ask you something. Try taking a look at Bionic Seaweed's stage page and tell me, why is E Kubilan Pasalan a bad choice for this stage? If you don't know already, E Kubilan Pasalan is Kubiluga's true form, in which he does a very low damage, but he does wave attack and have critical attack. I'll link the Bionic Seaweed stage page on the description and try taking a look at that, and maybe you can comment down the answers and tell me why E Kubilan is such a bad choice for Bionic Seaweed. That's it for now. I hope. I don't know, maybe you can see how people usually create their strats and abuse the game mechanics, and perhaps you even find your own original stats that changes the meta. Also, do tell me if there's something that you want me to talk about next, cause these are pretty fun to do even though they tend to make me not sleep at night. Anyways, see you next time, I guess. I swear I'm so bad at keeping script short.